Today we're beginning our section on the nervous system. To begin with, our nervous system is divided into different regions anatomically, and it's divided into different parts functionally as well. First of all, we have what's called a central nervous system. Which typically we call the CNS, Central Nervous System, CNS. In addition to the central nervous system, oh, by the way, this includes the brain and spinal cord. Brain and spinal cord make up your central nervous system. Your peripheral nervous system consists of nerve fibers extending away from the central nervous system. So nerve fibers from central nervous system. And it includes peripheral nerve cell types, and their fibers. So these are your two primary anatomical divisions. We'll go back and revisit this a little bit later, talking about origins of the spinal cord, and we'll look also at what these peripheral nerve cell types are and their organization structurally with the functional divisions of the nervous system. Next, the function of the nervous system is to receive and send out neural signals and integrate neural signals. A simple way of understanding the function of the nervous system is to look at it in this way. First of all, we have what we call receptors that receive neural information from the environment, visual signals, tactile signals, all of our different kinds of senses and ways of being aware of our environment out there. Those signals are relayed into the central nervous system. This pathway from the receptors to the central nervous system is through those peripheral nerves. This route inward we refer to as the sensory route, also known as the afferent, A-F-F-E-R-E-N-T, route. An alternative name for that. So we'll talk about afferent nerve fibers sometimes. That means the ones that extend toward the central nervous system. The central nervous system can also send signals out, and those go along fibers to effectors. Effectors are, for the most part, muscles and glands. So your voluntary and involuntary movements out there, the heart muscle as well as the digestive tube and other structures, internal visceral organs, receive signals from the central nervous system, and of course all your voluntary movements as well. This outward pathway, instead of being sensory, is called the motor route, and that is also known as efferent, E-F-F-E-R-E-N-T. Now, the central nervous system can receive, integrate the information, make some kind of decision or response pattern that will be expressed as an outgoing message to the effectors, or your central nervous system can initiate functions without any stimulus from the sensory route. So you can have a thought and initiate a response. So this is a simplified view of what's going on with your nervous system. overall functions of the nervous system. Incoming information from receptors along sensory routes or afferent routes, integration in your central nervous system, initiation of responses or behaviors from your central nervous system carried out to the effectors to bring about those responses through what we call motor routes or efferent routes. This is peripheral nervous system, this is peripheral nervous system here. Next, two major functional divisions of our nervous system include what we call the somatic branch. These are voluntary, or where we have conscious awareness, I suppose is a better way of saying it, conscious awareness of what goes on. So it's kind of self-explanatory, but what you see, smell, feel, so forth, those are sensory components of somatic. And then the motor components of the somatic branch would be voluntary movements, all involving skeletal muscle, moving your body voluntarily. So that's the somatic branch. Works at the conscious level, you have conscious awareness of what's going on, both sensory and motor. The other branch, autonomic, this works at a subconscious level. So you don't have conscious awareness of what's going on with these functions. For example, establishing your heart rate would be an example. Dilation of your blood vessels would be an example. You have some way of sensing with some cells that are in blood vessels above your heart how much carbon dioxide is in your blood and what your blood pressure is like. And that's relayed to the brain, and your brain responds to that. So you have, for both of these, the somatic and the autonomic, you have sensory functions that are coming in, and you have motor functions that go back out. These are at the conscious level, and you're aware of what's going on. These are at the subconscious level. You're not aware of those functions when they happen. These autonomic functions are then subsequently divided into two different groups. Before I go on to that, the somatic functions and the autonomic functions operate in different parts of your central nervous system. The way they're integrated, the path that they take. So even though your brain and spinal cord look like one kind of continuous structure, there are some regions that are dedicated to somatic functions. There are other regions of your nervous system that are dedicated to autonomic functions. And also the autonomic portions are divided into what we call parasympathetic functions. Parasympathetic, these are those day-to-day kind of routine physiological functions that are regulated by the nervous system. Your normal digestive behaviors or actions and blood pressure and heart rate and breathing rate, those sorts of things are under the operation of parasympathetic branch. The sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system is what's usually referred to as the fight or flight system. Fight or flight. So under conditions of, say, more extreme stress, anxiety, anger, fear, extreme excitement of some kind, that's under the operation of the sympathetic branch. So you have heightened blood pressure, heart rate, breathing rate, affects a lot of different functions. So this is considered the fight or flight system here, and these are the normal operating conditions. These work as what I call a teeter-totter fashion, so that when the sympathetic system is excited, the parasympathetic system is inhibited. So you have less activity in the parasympathetic branch when the sympathetic branch is excited. And conversely, when the sympathetic branch is not activated for any particular reason, then we have an increase in the amount of activity in the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. Next, we're going to look at how these different regions are different. These different divisions, these branches are different in their locations within the nervous system, where their signals are coming from and going to, and so forth. First of all, our somatic pathway, or somatic nervous pathway. All of the motor nerves that are involved in sending signals out to the peripheral nervous, or the peripheral organs out there that bring about the effects of our motor signals, our voluntary motor signals. The neurons are found within the central nervous system here. They could be in the brain or the spinal cord, but anyway, they send out a fiber that goes out through the peripheral nervous system then. This is a motor nerve fiber reaching out to an effector, and the effectors for the somatic pathway are always skeletal muscle. So our pathway is directly from the central nervous system by way of a peripheral nerve to the effector, which is always skeletal muscle, a voluntary response. Somatic pathway, we have conscious awareness of that behavior. We control that behavior consciously. Next, looking at the, we'll do parasympathetic next. In the parasympathetic pathway, we still have a neuron within the central nervous system. It's in a different location a little bit than what we had with the somatic nerve, and it reaches out, and we have what's called a preganglionic nerve fiber. It comes out and it extends out a long distance from the central nervous system, usually, and this just indicates that it goes and goes and goes, and eventually will stop and synapse with another nerve cell type. So we're going to synapse with this, what's called a ganglion cell here, and that ganglion cell is going to send a fiber on out a short distance to its effector out there. The effector there could be smooth muscle or it could be a gland. So I'll draw in a gland out there on the far end to be the effector. So here's a gland here. So we start off in the central nervous system. This is called a preganglionic fiber. It extends almost all the way out to the organ typically, and then will synapse with the ganglion cell. Here's your ganglion cell. And then there's a short section here called a postganglionic fiber. And it will typically not be skeletal muscle that it's affecting, but it's going to be visceral muscle. Or a gland. In this case, we have a gland in our picture. Visceral muscle simply refers to any non-voluntary muscle. So your heart muscle and your smooth muscle in the body would be considered visceral muscle. But visceral muscle and glands are affected by the autonomic nervous system. So here, this is one branch of the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic branch, has a nerve cell in the central nervous system. It's a motor cell for the autonomic branch, and it sends a long nerve preganglionic fiber out to a ganglion cell. The ganglion cell has a short postganglionic fiber that reaches to the effector. Next, we need to talk about sympathetic pathways. The sympathetic pathway begins the same way as the parasympathetic. We have a nerve cell. It sends out an axon fiber, but it doesn't go nearly as far before it meets up with the ganglion cell. So here's our ganglion cell here. And that ganglion cell will send out a long postganglionic fiber to reach to its effector. So here we have, in this case, we still have a ganglion cell in the middle between the motor cell and the effector, but the ganglion cell is typically placed close to the original motor neuron. And then we have a much longer postganglionic fiber. So this is preganglionic, and this is postganglionic. This is our ganglion cell. And out there we have some kind of effector. Let's go ahead and this time we'll put in a smooth muscle cell or two. All right, so structurally, the somatic, parasympathetic, and sympathetic have different route patterns to the effector. Somatic motor nerves carry the signal directly to the effector, which is always a skeletal muscle. Parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system has a motor nerve fiber that reaches to a ganglion cell, and then the ganglion cell has a short postganglionic fiber that affects either a heart muscle, smooth muscle, or a gland as drawn in here. The sympathetic branch has a short preganglionic fiber from the motor nerve neuron, and the ganglion is usually placed close to the nervous system, closer to the central nervous system, and then it usually has a longer postganglionic fiber that reaches out to heart muscle or smooth muscle or gland out there as the effector. Now there's one more example to consider here associated with the sympathetic nervous system where a typical effector is not shown in the sequence, and I'll draw that next. Now a note about sympathetic stimulation of the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla is capable of releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream. And the way this works is you still have that sympathetic motor neuron, as we did in that last example, but here we have the what would be thought of as a preganglionic fiber reach out to the adrenal gland. This is coming from the spinal cord to the adrenal gland. And in the adrenal gland, we have cells that will release that epinephrine into the bloodstream. So here's our motor neuron. This is considered still a preganglionic fiber. We don't really think of these as ganglion cells, but they behave in a similar fashion. But instead of having a postganglionic fiber where a fiber will affect a gland or a visceral muscle directly by a fiber, it simply releases the neurotransmitter into the bloodstream, and that neurotransmitter then affects all kinds of responses in those organs that respond to epinephrine and norepinephrine. So this is a sympathetic motor neuron. This extends through the peripheral nervous system. We're still going to call it a preganglionic fiber. nerve fiber, but instead of going to a ganglion cell type, it is going to adrenal medulla cells. And they release primarily epinephrine to the blood. So circulating levels of epinephrine increase with sympathetic stimulation to the adrenal medulla. Now I need to say something about the neurotransmitters that are different in the different pathways. Again, we're looking at, this is somatic up here. Somatic, and this is the parasympathetic route. And this is the sympathetic route here. So here, remember, we have the nerve fiber that goes directly to the effector out here. And at the effector, in all of our somatic branch connections out here, the neurotransmitter, the chemical that is released to stimulate the skeletal muscle in this case, is acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is the chemical that's going to affect the skeletal muscle out there. Next, in our parasympathetic branch, we're going to have neurotransmitters released here between the end of the preganglionic fiber, and then another neurotransmitter released here at the postganglionic fiber. In both of these cases, we're going to abbreviate this to save space a little bit, but acetylcholine, ACH, same as up here, is released. And then at the effector, we also generally have acetylcholine as the neurotransmitter type. Now, sympathetic stimulation. In sympathetic stimulation, we see something a little bit different. Still have acetylcholine here, released from the preganglionic fiber to the ganglion cell, but this type of ganglion cell typically does not release acetylcholine. In this case, norepinephrine is the chemical that's released to affect gland or smooth muscle or the heart muscle out there. So anyway, that's a difference we see in the kind of neurotransmitter that's used between parasympathetic and sympathetic. Acetylcholine is always used at skeletal muscle and from preganglionic fibers, whether it's parasympathetic or sympathetic. Acetylcholine is used by parasympathetic, typically, not always, but typically, to bring about its effect, and norepinephrine from the sympathetic branch at the effector from the postganglionic fiber. Remember that stimulation of the adrenal gland, the sympathetic stimulation of the adrenal gland, the adrenal medulla cells, they released epinephrine directly into the bloodstream. They could release some norepinephrine as well, but it's primarily epinephrine released directly into the bloodstream, which circulates rather than being released from a axon terminal. Okay, we already know that the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches are different functionally, how they stimulate the body. We know that the sympathetic system at its postganglionic fiber releases a norepinephrine neurotransmitter, while acetylcholine is used by the parasympathetic branch. What we haven't pointed out is that they have different areas of origin for their motor nerve origins here. First of all, the parasympathetic branch has cranial nerves, number 3, number 7, number 9, and number 10 involved in sending their signals out here. Also down here, sacral nerves. These are sacral, numbers 2, 3, and 4. Nerves 2, 3, and 4 from the sacral region, those spinal nerves down here, and these cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10 send out signals that bring about the parasympathetic effects throughout the body, whatever those might be. For that reason, this is referred to sometimes as the craniosacral branch. Craniosacral. It's just an alternative name based on where the nerve roots are for the parasympathetic branch, craniosacral branch. The sympathetic branch has their nerves originating here in thoracic 1 through 12, so all the thoracic region, and lumbar 1 and 2. Lumbar 1 and 2. And for that reason, it's called the thoracolumbar division. Thoracolumbar division as opposed to a craniosacral division of the nervous system. So craniosacral, parasympathetic, thoracolumbar, that's the sympathetic branch.